Great. Thanks. Well, again, welcome to our monthly chapter meeting. Tonight's talk is titled A 27-Year Wildflower Journey, The Making of Beauty and the Beast, California Wildflowers and Climate Change. We welcome internationally acclaimed conservation photographers Rob Badger and Nita Winter, who have been life partners, activists, and creative collaborators for more than 3 decades. Rob's environmental images have won multiple awards, including Best in Photojournalism and international competition. He was one of 3 American photographers chosen to document Russian nature preserves in Siberia. In 1998, he presented a slideshow documenting the impact of mining on our public lands at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. for the Sierra Club to support the Clinton administration's efforts to reform the antiquated 1872 mining law. Nita began her photographic career documenting her work fighting wildfires in Northern California and later as a national park ranger on Alcatraz. In 1986, Nita had her first major exhibit, The Children of the Tenderloin. This documentary project launched her career and directed her focus toward creating healthy communities. The series received extensive media coverage and showed her firsthand the power of photographic storytelling. Over the next 17 years, she produced and created portraits of 6 major public art projects celebrating the Bay Area's diverse communities. Their work has been featured in Time, Mother Jones, and Sierra magazines, the New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, and the Los Angeles Times. They are the recent recipients of the Sierra Club's 2020 Ansel Adams Award for Conservation Photography. Rob and Nita are here tonight, excited to take you behind the scenes on their 27-year journey photographing wildflowers throughout California and the West, and the making of Beauty and the Beast, California Wildflowers and Climate Change. Thank you both for being here, and we so look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Annie, for that nice introduction.
Yes,
and
thank you.
let me bring up our program here. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you for that nice introduction. And again, I'm so sorry that we flaked and we had to be called to be told you are giving a presentation this evening. So we're so grateful to see so many of you here. I lived in Southern California for 5 years, 2 different times, and I love all the beauty that's there. So I hope you'll enjoy our story about our 27-year journey, as she said, photographing wildflowers and what we are wanting to do with our project to inspire hope and action regarding species extinction, habitat loss, and climate change.
And I just want to mention that the Channel Islands has been a place that has been on Rob's bucket list to go photograph wildflowers, and we have never made it there, unfortunately, but maybe someday.
I've been to Anacapa Island and snorkeled around there.
So Beauty and the Beast, Wildflowers and Climate Change is a multifaceted project. And it took a lot of different people and organizations to help us make it happen. Without the California Native Plant Society and the individuals in different chapters helping to direct us to different locations, we wouldn't have found all the flowers that we photographed. Plus, CNPS is a co-publisher of our book, and we were very grateful for their support along the way. And we looked for a diverse group of voices for the wildflowers as well, as we'll explain a little later. And if you have to leave early and you want to be able to listen to a recording of this talk that we gave to the California Historical Society, we welcome you to go to wildflowerbooks.com, and that's also where we have the books available.
So this all started in 1992. I was at a film lab in San Francisco processing some landscape film, and I met a fellow photographer, Liz Hymans, and she said, you know, the Antelope Valley California Poppy Reserve is having a really, really good year after 6 years of drought. She said, you know, you've been a landscape photographer in California for years. I'm sure you've been to the Poppy Reserve. I said, you know, kind of sheepishly, no. She said, really? Really? Well, you know, you and I have to go down. So a couple days later, she and a friend of ours and I drove from the Bay Area all the way down to the Poppy Reserve. And this was what we saw. What made this a really exceptional year was the fact that there were these beautiful purple-tipped bird's eye gilia scattered in amongst these glowing California poppies. Normally, the times that we've been there since, you'll see the Poppy Reserve covered with a lot of beautiful poppies, but not this diversity of flowers. So I called Nita the second evening, well, probably the second evening we were there, and I said, you really, really have to see this. I don't know how long this is going to last. It looks like it's at the peak bloom. If we get heat and drying winds, this is going to be gone. So I drove back up to San Francisco to get her. We came back down and spent a few days photographing, and this was what really got us engaged, hooked, and addicted to photographing wildflowers. And again, this all started in 1992.
So this is BLM land that we were exploring, as well as the reserve. And I was a people photographer at the time. So I was on assignment and wasn't able to go down with Rob initially. And my degree from Clark University, Massachusetts, was actually in biology. So this was bringing me back full circle. So we, as Rob said, we were hooked growing up in the East Coast, never seeing anything like this. As I mentioned, I was a people photographer. Rob was a mostly nature photographer. When we met 36 years ago in a photo lab, I was waiting for my prints, and this wonderful prince showed up.
Thank you. You say that every time, and it always makes me smile.
And then years later, after discovering the wildflowers, that became our main focus for both of us.
So people often ask, well, how far back do the images go? What's the earliest wildflower photograph you have in the book? This was a beautiful area I wanted to photograph that had a good reputation for abundant
Buckeye trees.
Yeah, buckeye trees. Thank you. I should know. So I was looking for the buckeye tree, and I found these pretty purple flowers. That time I didn't know what they were. So I said, well, I might as well include them in the book. So this was taken 2 years before I met Nita. This was taken in 1984. It was done on film, and I photographed using film until 2005, when I got a digital camera, and it made photography so much easier, especially macro photography.
And this is the oldest image, but all the other images in the book and the project were actually taken within that 27-year period that we talked about.
So as Nita mentioned, when she met me, I had been a landscape photographer for a while. In the introduction, you also heard that I had done a lot of work on environmental issues. And after photographing devastated areas, logging, mining, water issues, it became really depressing going out and photographing these things. And I finally decided that, well, there must be something I can do with beautiful nature photography, like so many nature photographers had done in the past, like Ansel Adams, that there's got to be a way to use the beauty of nature and wildflowers to promote activism, to promote action, and to help save what is left.
So that's why we decided to use the wildflowers for that purpose. And as Annie mentioned, I was a firefighter for CDF, which is now CAL FIRE, and I always kept a camera on my belt. And on the left, you have a helicopter water drop on a pile of land moving equipment tires. That's why the smoke is so black. And I entered this photo into the Nikon International Competition just as I was starting my career, and I was thrilled to get an honorable mention. And on the right is a photograph from the Children of the Tenderloin series, which, as Annie mentioned, launched my career in celebrating diversity and creating happy, healthy communities. On the left was a powwow I photographed at San Francisco State, and it was used in one of many images to illustrate calendars for the Children's Defense Fund out of Washington, D.C. And on the right is became a 7-foot banner. I did a series of projects called The Faces of different communities where I photographed residents and people who worked in the community to show the diversity that was there, whether it was ethnic diversity, sexual preference, age diversity, et cetera. And so this was one of 5 of them in an area called the Canal District, known for its large Hispanic population. And I was doing the people work for many years, and I started to have some memory issues when I was perimenopausal and became very anemic. So it was really difficult for me to continue to do the photo assignments, the people assignments, but it allowed me, once I got my blood levels back up, to actually go out in the field a lot more with Rob to photograph the flowers.
So this image was taken south of Lake Tahoe in El Dorado National Forest. We were told that around Carson Pass, which is about 9,000 feet, in the area, in this big general area, there was a convergence of a few different bioregions. And so what that meant to us was that with these overlapping bioregions, we'd find a greater abundance, a greater diversity of different wildflower species. So we decided we were going to backpack in there instead of doing our normal day hikes where we were photographing landscapes and flowers just during the day. So I was carrying 85 pounds of gear. Nita was carrying 65 pounds of gear. We did that once and we decided we were never going to do that again. So in all the following images we've done after that, we've done on day hikes, and that's how we've been getting our flowers since then. I think this was 2005.
And this is Lake Winnemucca Lake in the background. So many of you may have heard of it. And it's a wonderful area. And what was really interesting is this is after Labor Day. This, with the swings of precipitation, this was one of the years where there was a tremendous amount of snow. And so the flowers were actually 3 to 4 weeks late. Usually you get them at the end of July, beginning of August. Well, here we are in September. In this particular spot, you can't see very many flowers, but where we were camping and other areas, there were still a lot of flowers. In order to be able to afford to do this work, we were fortunate to connect with art consultants and architects and have our work used in both the construction of hospitals as well as framed artwork.
So this is an image of California poppies that I created using a technique called the contact series, and I'll talk about that later. I've discovered a way that I could get the flower petals gently in touch with a filter over the front of the lens. We'll talk about that later when we take you behind the scenes and show you how we actually get all the flowers out in the field using natural light, with the flowers safe and sound in the ground.
And this particular project at Kaiser Redwood City, we had 34 images built into the architecture. And these are 8 foot tall by 20 feet wide translucent lobby dividers. And as you know, there are flowers 12 months of the year. There aren't very many in the middle of the winter. So we like to go out and find birds to photograph. This was the Woodbridge Ecological Preserve near Lodi, Merced National Wildlife Refuge. And we were fortunate to be able to use these images also as artwork in the hospitals. And we aren't always as literal with the birds as we are with the flowers. Flowers, we generally try to get it back to what we saw. And we also love watching the rest of nature that's around us. And in this case, we were up on the bluffs above San Gregorio Beach, and this juvenile red-tailed hawk was flying right overhead. This is not with a telephoto lens. This is probably with like a 50-millimeter lens just over my head.
So one of the joys in spending an hour with a flower is that we are, both deeply immersed in that habitat, in that environment. We hear birds sing, we see the insects that are there, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to just slow down and take in everything that nature has to offer in all the different places that we've photographed. And people ask us frequently, well, you've been photographing wildflower blooms since 1992. You must have a favorite super bloom. And I said, yes, indeed we do. Above the town of Gorman in the Grapevine, in 2003, there was an immense, fantastic bloom of California wildflowers, and I had been photographing and traveling over there since 1966, and I'd never seen anything like that. From the freeway to the top of the ridge was 1,200 feet, and then for a mile and a half wide, it was completely covered with flowers. So this is a detail of the flowers that were creating all the colors in the landscapes we saw. That was our most favorite super bloom. Again, this was in 2003.
And we were lucky that on the west side of the freeway, and Highway 5 goes between these two hills, on the west side of the freeway was public land, was the Hungry Valley State Vehicular Recreation Area. So we drove up there and we were able to look back across at the private land that was in full bloom. And we're hoping someday that gets protected.
So what made this a really unique experience was the fact that we arrived there the previous evening at the tail end of a storm. We woke up the next morning and the storm was clearing. So there was all these beautiful dark gray clouds in the background with these shafts of light moving over the different ridges and over the landscape. So it was a really mesmerizing experience to see as the light was changing. It was the hardest thing to do was to photograph, was to select a certain composition because everything was changing and everything was so beautiful. But again, this was in 2003 and we were doing film back then and we haven't seen anything since.
But the second favorite, came in a close second, was the Carrizo Plain in 2017. We did not get down there this year because we're involved in Marin Open Studios and some other things, and unfortunately, but we heard that this year might have even been better. And this is coming over the Tembler Mountains from the Bakersfield side. And what was really interesting was the difference between the south-facing slope full of south-facing slope without flowers and the north-facing slope. We also, what our favorite part of it was this field of desert candles. This was in the Caliente Mountains on the east side, west side, excuse me, on the west side. So the Carrizo Plain runs north and south, the Tembler Mountains on the east side, the Caliente Mountains on the west side. And there were tens of thousands of these desert candles. And before this trip, we had never actually seen them. Do you want to talk about your favorite flower?
Yeah, another question we get frequently asked is, well, you've probably photographed hundreds and hundreds of flowers. Do you have a favorite one? Well, we have a few favorite, but At the top of the list for me is the desert candle, and you probably know it's a member of the mustard family. It's got a really, really long, hollow stalk, and at the tip there are these intense magenta buds. When the buds open, you have these delicate white flowers, and at the base are these graceful green leaves. So it's a very, very unusual flower, and it's probably one of my top two favorites. The other may be the datura or one of the other poppies.
And one of my favorites is the columbine. So this is the view coming down off the Caliente Mountains, looking back towards the Tembler Mountains, towards Bakersfield. And this is a detail of some of those flowers, and it was actually taken with my iPhone 6. And we figured we've used 12 different cameras over the 27-year period, starting with a Hasselblad and Canon cameras for film, and moving on to Canon digitals, and eventually Sony cameras with Canon lenses.
One thing I forgot to mention, I wanted to emphasize was, if we didn't say this earlier, was almost everything has been done on public lands, and that was intentional. We could have gone to botanical gardens to photograph flower, to easily photograph flowers, but that would have deprived us of being in the habitat where all these flowers are found. And it was our intention to show people in the book and in our traveling exhibit what is remaining on our public lands that so many people for so many years, so many organizations, including CNPS, has put so much energy into protecting. So I told you earlier that we want to take you behind the scenes to show you how we photograph the flowers out in the field. So in our book, in the back of the book, there's a section called Behind the Scenes, and I'll describe how we photograph the flowers. In the upper left-hand corner on the left page is an image of a
Sneezeweed.
Of a sneezeweed, and our intention is to show as much detail as we can, so anyone looking at the image can see what the flower really looks like. We put black or white backgrounds behind the flowers while the flowers are still safe and sound in the ground, and we do that to make the flowers pop out, and also to eliminate any distracting backgrounds that may be behind the flower and take away from the impression of the beauty of the flower.
And when Rob says as much detail, it means that we try to get everything in focus as much as possible.
So after putting fabric behind the flowers, it kind of, and making them look, just the background be a complete black or complete white, I thought, well, what if I use the fabric as a compositional element and wrap the fabric around the flower and arrange the folds so it adds to the beauty of the overall picture. So this is what I call the wrap series, and sometimes it works and then sometimes it doesn't.
And a fabric that we found that worked really well is chiffon, because it gave you really nice folds. It's a very light fabric, so if there's much of a breeze, it's really hard to work with.
And on the bottom, that the pink checker bloom is an example of what I call the contact series. I discovered that if I put an extension tube between the camera and the wide angle zoom lens that I have, I can focus right up to the front of the lens with a filter on it. I can gently bring the flower petals or some part of the flower in contact with the front of the lens. And so, because the light that would normally be falling on the flower and be reflected off it, because that light is being blocked by the camera and the lens, the light that's available for the photograph, is whatever is being reflected off of whatever's in the background. And so you get this really nice, soft, transmitted translucent light coming through the flower petals.
And he also tries to keep something in the image in focus. And this allowed Rob to get off the tripod and be more spontaneous. The images are his, hers, and ours. Mostly ours, because it really took two people. I was known as Eagle Eyes as a kid, so I have this really great eye-brain connection, so I'm really good at finding flowers. I found this desert lily the night before, but it was getting too dark. So we came back the next morning and created this setup in order to light it the way we wanted to light it.
At that time, I was using a film camera. You can see me, I think you can see me holding a Polaroid there. It took about 2.5 hours to get everything right because it took so long to do the Polaroids and make all the lighting adjustments. Everything you see here has some purpose. The collection of clothing on the ground was put there intentionally so that there weren't any bright highlights on the sand beneath this beautiful desert lily. Normally, that desert lily probably grows up to as far as the top of the camera, with flowers alternating up and down one single stalk. Well, this year was an El Nino rain year, an abundant rain year, and the plant was putting a lot of energy into 3 stalks and multiple buds and multiple blossoms. So it's not the typical example of the beautiful white desert lily that most people see.
And I wanted to point out, the sun is coming from the left. This is early morning, and the flowers on the left were getting lit, but the ones on the right were in shadow. So we set up these reflectors in order to even out the light. And that's one of the reasons why it takes us so long to photograph, is to work with the light. We don't do flash. We do all available sunlight, and occasionally moonlight, which is actually technically sunlight. We live 5 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin City near Sausalito, and quite a few images in the book are from this area because we have just so much public land, 40% of the county, and so much biodiversity as well. And Rob was carrying 85 pounds that year when
65.
we went.
Oh yeah.
No, you were carrying 85. When we went up to Carson Pass area, normally he would carry 65 pounds of equipment, reflectors, camera equipment, tripod, etc. I would carry probably about 20 or 25 pounds. And I was really fortunate that he was willing to do so much of this hard work and be uncomfortable. Sometimes once I found a flower, he would set up to photograph. Sometimes he'd find the flower, and then we would both look at either the Polaroid early on or what was in the digital camera and get feedback. As I'm holding diffusion discs or windbreaks, I could see the flowers from a different angle. So sometimes after Rob did his first setup, we may change the angle and work from another direction.
Therefore, we tell people the photographs are his, hers, and ours.
So this was a cloudy day. We didn't need to use any diffusion discs. And we'll talk about that a little more later.
As we mentioned, we put black and or white backgrounds behind the flowers, make all the images, and then go home and look at them in the computer and decide which one we think works best with the particular flower.
And in this case, we felt the black worked better. Sometimes it can be really windy to the point where we need to pull out a tent to cut the wind and be able to photograph a flower, especially something that's on a long stem.
In this area, we had been looking for a really good example of a local Franciscan paintbrush, and we found this beautiful plant. So after taking an image of most of the plant. I looked really, really closely at the top, and I said, you know, sometimes it's fun just to find an abstract impression of part of the flower. So I photographed the top of it. When I looked closely, moved in closely and looked through the macro lens and put with the white background behind it, it just looked like these crimson flames were coming out of the top of this plant.
So we first consider ourselves photographers and artists. We do not consider ourselves truly as botanists. So that gives us some extra leeway to be creative in the way and not as literal at times. We always photograph in a place where we won't create damage, next to roads, next to fields.
Nita's always telling me to watch my boots when I'm kneeling down, that I'm not digging something up, I'm not hurting some plant. She's a good plant cop there.
And sometimes you look at plants from a different angle, not always straight on, to make something interesting. And for those of you who have come across the Western azalea, you also know not only are they beautiful, but they have a wonderful fragrance. They're probably the most fragrant flower we've photographed. And this is on Mount Tamalpais in Marin County. And in the end, it felt like they were dancing.
This is Nita's setup of a Shasta iris we took in Plumas National Forest, which is north of Sacramento.
And this was my final image. And most of these images are in the book. And this is a desert datura that we photographed in Joshua Tree National Park. And as we said, we try to find subjects that are near the road where we won't create a lot of damage. And we use diffusion discs often in the middle of the day so that we can control the light, so there isn't harsh shadows and highlights. In this case, we put the diffusion disc behind the flower so that when we photographed it, the petals felt like they were lit from inside. And then we put a reflector under the camera to fill in the shadows in facing this side. And if you go to wildflowerbooks.com and to the video section, you can see a sampler that we created. We're working on raising funds to create an audio described version of our project for the visually impaired. So if you can't see our flowers or wildflowers in general, we will bring you into their world and our world through words and sounds. So at the end, we'll give you a connection if any of you are interested in supporting the project. This is Ring Mountain in Marin County with Mount Tamalpais in the background. This is one of our favorite places to photograph. This is another example of the Wrapped series. And this area was protected. It's an ecological preserve because of this flower, the Tiburon Mariposa lily, that only grows on Ring Mountain in probably 3 or 4 locations and nowhere else in the world.
We've hiked up to 13,000-foot passes in Colorado, 11,000-foot passes in the Eastern Sierra to get some true alpine species.
Get another wrapped one in order to get rid of the distracting gravel behind the flowers.
On the way back, we found this beautiful alpine columbine and wrapped this white flower in a nice, graceful black background. And we thought it, like we mentioned before, it takes about an hour to do a flower. So we are experimenting with both sunlight, if the sun's out, if we think that's appropriate, or we'll put a diffusion disc over the flower and soften the light that way. And so with the previous photograph, you could see there are these beautiful specular highlights on the petals that the sun has created. And it's a much more contrasty, dynamic image. But then when you use a diffusion disc, you soften it up, you soften the whole feeling up, and the same flower looks very, very, very different. Another question we get asked is, well, how much Photoshop work do you do? Well, our goal is always to create a final image after processing in Photoshop that would look like what anyone would see if anyone were there, to show the true colors and the true quality of light. So this was what the camera sensor recorded. The camera sensor records the exact color of light falling on the scene. This scene was lit by blue skylight. There was only a little bit of sunlight in the extreme center at the top of the frame. So the camera sensor, as I said, records the color of the light, but our eyes adjust for that so that we see what the true colors are. The camera sensor is also designed to capture as many different subtle tones of light, brightness and darkness. So it creates a very flat image that creates all that different tonality. It's also designed to create as many different colors as possible. So it creates a low saturated image. Well, we bring the image, the raw image, into Photoshop and do the adjustments we need to do so that it would look like, as I said before, what anyone would see if they were actually there. So in this instance, in the raw image, the white petals had a blue cast to them. So we had to color correct, change the color balance to make sure that the white flowers actually showed up white in the image. So that's the Photoshop work that we do. We also do a lot of cleanup work with the background. And in this instance of the leopard lily, we photographed on Mount Tam. We had a big sheet on a big pole behind the flower, and there were all these distracting shades of white. We brought it into Photoshop, brought the whites up, and that was what we saw.
This is the 2-page spread, the way it appears in the book. We also have to deal with sand and blowing wind. In this case, we were photographing a buckwheat up above Independence, right?
Yeah.
And south side of the Sierra Mountains. And this plant is very low to the ground. So we had to take 2 pieces of fabric and slip them under the plant. So you see the overlap there, plus all the sand and how low contrast and saturated it is. So we take it into Photoshop and we clean it up, bring up the saturation, bring up the contrast. And again, how it appears in the 2-page spread. So I mentioned we deal with wind, we've dealt with rain, we've dealt with heat, cold, and on our trip to Capitol Reef National Monument, we weren't quite prepared for the no-see-ums. And for those of you who know no-see-ums, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, they are worse than mosquitoes. They are tiny. They can get up your nose, in your ears, in your clothes, and their bite is actually worse than mosquito bites, and they last longer. So in this case, we were in the middle of nowhere. We had just been driving for hours on our way to Taos, New Mexico. We had found this penstemon we wanted to photograph, and within 5 minutes, the no-see-ums had found us. So I had to go back to the car, go get clean underwear, and put them over our heads so we could keep them out of our ears.
And it didn't make any sense to us why these things would show up a few minutes after we were there, like they had almost followed us from the last place. So I did some research and I learned that the no-see-ums use the nectar of the flower as their nourishment, but they need blood from an animal to reproduce. So as Nita mentioned, I'm spending a lot of time on the ground in one position, and no-see-ums got me. And but it's sometimes what you need to do to get the flowers that you want. And
we figured Rob had 200 bites on him.
Yeah.
So our exhibit started at the Jewett Gallery at San Francisco Main Library. We had been photographing throughout the West and had created a project, Beauty and the Beast, Wildflowers and Climate Change. And they asked us to do an exhibit that focused on California. So we created an exhibit with 100 images and cases that, in the cases, we had things like the guidebooks that we would work with, letting people know that binoculars are great to use, not only for birds, but also for flowers, if you want to see what's up ahead or up a hill. And we discovered these wonderful knee pads, great for gardening, great for photographing. They're like kneeling in stiff jello, and they're made by a company called Ergodyne.
Wearing these allowed me to spend a lot more time on my knees, being much more comfortable on the ground, and not feeling some of the rocky places where we were photographing flowers. So it just made my life so much easier.
So half of this image became a traveling exhibit managed by a nonprofit called Exhibit Envoy. And between that and the exhibit that custom exhibit we had at the San Diego Natural History Museum, we figure over 100,000 people have seen our exhibit. And it was created to inspire hope and action. So this was an exhibit called California Blooming, Wildflowers and Climate Change in the Golden State.
Morro Bay.
Oh, yes. Right now it's at Morro Bay Natural History Museum until middle of September. Next year it goes up to Reading. So if anybody knows of a place that would be good for the exhibit, please let us know. So there are text panels in the exhibit, but we wanted to go beyond that and give wildflowers more voices. So we decided to do a coffee table book. And we have 18 short stories by 16 diverse authors. 11 of them are women. So scientists, nature writers, conservation, environmental leaders, people like Jose Gonzalez, who's the founder of Latino Outdoors, and Margaret Leinen, who's the director of Scripps Oceanographic Institute. Our authors ranged from the age of 20 to Peter Raven, who was 82 at the time.
So when we created the book, our wonderful book designer,
Laura Lovett,
who was on the board of the local CNPS chapter, decided that the book should be divided into 3 different sections. So the first one was the gift of beauty, the human connection, and ensuring the future. And we were really, really fortunate to find Laura, because she was the former director of book design for Chronicle Books. So she had been doing beautiful books for years. She was a dedicated native plant person, and her influence throughout the book can be seen. We wanted to create a book so that wherever you opened it, you would find something really, really beautiful. And she created that book for us. So again, it was someone from CNPS that helped make the book possible.
In this section, Ensuring the Future, we include a list of 25 things you can do to make a difference. So again, about inspiring hope and action. We have the story Wildflowers and Climate Change by Gordon Lepick, who is with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Ryan Burnett wrote Chasing Spring, Timing is Everything, about his research up in the mountain meadows and how climate change was affecting them, and in turn was affecting the rufous hummingbird and its epic migration from Southern California, from Mexico to the Northwest.
Ryan Burnett did this wonderful article, like Nita mentioned, on phenology, which many of you probably know is the timing of natural events. So this beautiful image of this rufous-sided hummingbird.
Rufous hummingbird.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Rufous hummingbird was a wonderful accident. It's one of the most beautiful serendipitous images we've ever created. We were photographing this tall scarlet fritillary in Table Rocks area. It's a BLM and Nature Conservancy land outside of Medford, Oregon. And Nita was holding, what was holding still. We were waiting for the wind to die down, for the breeze to die down, because with the taller the flower is, the easier it moves in the slightest breeze. So we were waiting and waiting for the flower to stop moving. I looked quickly. When it stopped, I saw this hummingbird fly in. I got 2 frames and it was gone. So Nita waited, standing perfectly still there for a while, hoping that the bird would come back and we'd be ready and get some more frames, but it never did. On the right-hand side, you can see what the raw file was like before we processed it and took it into Photoshop and corrected it to give us what we actually saw and what anyone would see there.
We had information from the National Wildlife Federation on promoting pollinators. Susan Twite, who's a wonderful nature writer, wrote about the 5 deserts in California. Most people only know about 4 of them. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, who's a Native American botany professor, mother, and activist, wrote a wonderful story about what's in a name, about the naming of flowers. Wendy Takuda, when she retired from working as a news anchor here in the Bay Area, started doing some restoration work, and she wrote a very funny story called Zen in the Art of Pulling Broom. Amber Paris from the San Diego area and Climate Kids wrote Talking to Children About Climate Change Without Scaring Them. Genevieve Arnold, some of you may know her. She runs this seed bank at the Theodore Payne Foundation.
There's a section in the book devoted to fire ecology, fire recovery, what comes back after a fire has gone through. Susan Twite did a beautiful article on fire recovery called Phoenix from the Ashes. So we photographed different areas. This was in Cleveland National Forest in Orange County. A fire had gone through there the previous fall, I think. This is in Lake County, north of Napa up here. And we noticed in a lot of these areas that had been burned that what came back most abundantly were bulb plants. This area had been burned 6 months before, and 6 months later, a lot of the Clarkia came back. So we learned that Clarkia is a real abundant flower after fires go through.
And as Rob mentioned, the bulbs were very active in some areas, and the ash from the fires works as a fertilizer. And this was a really good wet year as well. And there are certain plants that also need the smoke to germinate. And we just talked to someone recently who found using liquid smoke on some of those seeds actually helped them germinate.
This area had all been completely burned. If you looked at the soil underneath the plants, these beautiful seep monkey flowers and larkspur, the soil was completely charred, and this was came back 6 months later. This was not on public land, but we really wanted to show people what came back after fires went through. This area had been completely burned. This was Pepperwood Preserve in Sonoma County, the Tubbs fire that burned a lot of Santa Rosa a few years ago. Nita found these two flowers together. I photographed them. So this is just some of the beauty that returns after fires had gone through.
And sometimes Rob photographs them in addition to me because he has got a bigger camera than I do. This is one of my images of Death Valley. We're going to quickly take you through some of our favorite areas in the deserts. I mean, we really love the deserts because you get to see so much of the geology. And sometimes you really have to look closely to find what's in bloom.
Go back. Nita carries a tripod, but doesn't often use it.
Being a people photographer, I wasn't used to being a tripod person like Rob was. So
I have the patience.
The desert broom rape that we found in the rocks. I had a very cooperative crab spider that allowed me to photograph it, and we found recently that crab spiders change color. And so when we would find a crab spider on a yellow flower, they would be bright yellow and they could actually change color, but we never found one that would stay still long enough for us to photograph until this one.
This image was taken in Death Valley. This was 1998, an El Nino abundant rain year. We were doing film, and there was just, it was amazing to see these beautiful desert sunflowers coming out of this coarse volcanic rock.
And this was called 100-year bloom that year. And 7 years later, this is Joshua Tree, was another 100-year bloom. And then there was another one. And then because of climate change, they're now called superblooms.
What was fascinating photographing in Joshua Tree was the fact that, you may know that Joshua Tree is known for its beautiful granite formations and for Joshua trees. Well, when this coarse granite weathers out, it creates these coarse granitic soils, and you look at these flowers growing out of what looks like this fine gravel that they just shouldn't be there. And it just shows us how tenacious and resilient life is and how beautiful it can be coming out of nothing. We were photographing it here in southern Joshua Tree, cottonwood wash. This is an example of a desert Canterbury bell. In a normal rain year, you can see how tall the flower is. Well, in 1998, again, in an El Nino year, there was an abundance of rain and it lasted way into March. So not only was there an abundance of different flowers coming out of the seed bank in the soil, but the flowers also grew taller because the rain lasted so long. So this was one of our favorite desert wildflower images in detail.
5 spots start closing up at 3. So you sometimes have to know the habits of your flowers in order to be able to photograph them. And we just love the diversity, the difference in shapes and colors and sizes that we would find. This is Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. We especially loved the southern end of it because there were fewer people. And it was just a really beautiful area. And it certainly has changed over the years. When we started going, there would be hundreds or maybe a few thousand people. Now there can be tens of thousands of people going out to the desert.
These are all double page spreads in the book.
And we were in Anza Borrego for 12 days, and 9 of them we had some kind of rain. So we had the unusual fog in the desert.
And so this is where it all started back in 1992. This super bloom image was taken, I think, 2010, again in the Antelope Valley, California Poppy Reserve. I'm pretty sure those are the San Gabriel Mountains in the background. And if you've been there, you know there's a good variety of flowers. There are gold fields, poppies, lupin, and so again, it's nice to do ground detail to show the abstract texture and patterns in this collection of flowers that are carpeting the land.
And as Rob mentioned, each year can be different. So you could have that variety, or in this particular year, which was the same year as the Gorman photos, there were just poppies. And I'm going to quickly take you through our garden, our native plant garden. This was a cedar waxwing that we photographed from our bedroom window. And it is not on a native, it's on an invasive cotoneaster. So we encourage people to plant something like toyons so that you can still feed the birds, but with the native plants. So of course, everybody talks about the monarch butterflies. We've planted milkweed. This year, our milkweed has done great because of the rains, but we still have not seen a single butterfly or caterpillar. So we're hoping they are going to show up, but these are caterpillars from previous years. And you also get other insects that enjoy the native plants. This is the biggest dragonfly I've ever seen, was on the milkweed. The seeds one year were just abundant. Wavy leaf soap plants. Blue-eyed grass. Especially love the ceanothus coming up our stairs. And the pollinators really love them. But they came up early this year. This is when you look super, super close at the flowers. You can see the grains of pollen on them. And the first 2 weeks they were blooming this year, they weren't pollinators yet. They were still underground and sleeping. If you want flowers that are later in the season, the Pacific, California fuchsia is wonderful. So you all probably know, since you're CNPS people, about Calscape and how to find the right plants for your particular area. PlantID.net for IDing plants, especially for beginners. CalFlora for more advanced searching of plants. Theodore Payne Foundation for your area is great for wildflower reports. DesertUSA.com as well. And again, we're did this project to make a difference and to get people to take actions. One option, as you probably know, is to become a citizen scientist through iNaturalist.org or Nature's Notebook and help scientists that are doing research throughout the world. Most of the flowers are photographed in California, but there are a few species like the prickly poppy that we photographed out of state, but it's found in California.
And we're always looking for interesting natural backgrounds for the flowers. We found this beautiful bludix in front of the serpentine rock in the Sierra foothills. So we photographed the flower without moving it, and sometimes we're just lucky to show the flower in its environment.
Table Mountain is a place that we love, which is starting to get inundated with people. So I think they have changed the way you can visit that location. We drove 150 miles to get the Mountain Lady Slipper on the left up to Quincy. And we're just about done. Here's a few more double page spreads in the book. And it was a challenge to edit. We started out with probably 300 images and ended up with 190 in the book. And just, again, love the diversity that we find. The shapes, the sizes, the colors. Native orchids. CNPS helped us put together a map of the ecological regions of California that are found both in the exhibit and in the book. There's a glossary for since we have so many essays, for people who may not know particular terms. We have the glossary as well as 2 indices, a plant name index as well as a location index. And as far as the book is concerned, we have a regular edition book and a deluxe signed limited edition book that comes in a clamshell box. And if you get the regular edition book or get access to one, we encourage you to peel back the paper jacket to see this special cover that Laura designed underneath. So as far as the project that we're working on for the visually impaired, we are a sponsored project of marinlink.org, so we can accept tax-deductible donations. So if anybody is inspired to help us out, or you know somebody who might be interested, we'd love to hear from you. You can also contact us through our website or through Nita at winterbadger.com.
And thank you for coming. Thank you for all the people that stayed. We like to end our show with a first letting you know, again, you can find the book at wildflowerbooks.com. And also, we like to end it with this wonderful quote from David Brower: "Truth and beauty can still win battles. We need more art, more passion, and more wit in defense of the earth." So thank you, CNPS, for everything you've done to help us get our book, our project, and our exhibit out.
So thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Nita. That was lovely.
Thank you.
You can't hear the applause, but it's happening
Okay.
on muted screens. Do we have any questions for Rob and Nita before we say goodnight?
I have one question. Do you use focus stacking?
I tried getting a rack where I could crank out as I go farther, because I noticed when I tried it that if I just stayed with the same distance between the camera and the flower, as I changed the focus, it changed the size of the image with each exposure. So I would have to use a rail, a focusing rail. And I'm working out in the field and it's windy. So I'm grateful for when it stops once. So I tried it and it just became too cumbersome and took too long. I've got a 42 megapixel Sony A7R mirrorless camera that, because it's got so much resolution, I can photograph farther back and get more depth of field.
Right.
without needing to focus stack. So you understand that.
Yes.
Yeah. But a lot of photographers ask me that, and for landscapes, yeah.
Right.
But for individual floral portraits, I just gave up my focusing rail and
Okay.
never used it.
They're stunning photographs. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How were the flowers this year in your area? I assume as wild as they were in other areas.
Yeah, I went. Well, I was in Carrizo, and I think I was a little early actually, and it was pretty abundant. So
That seemed to be the place where everyone was saying that we kept running into people over and over again as we're promoting our book or talking to people that Carrizo Plain was the #1 place to go this year.
It was pretty spectacular, but we also took a trip out to Santa Rosa Island, and that was phenomenal. I mean, that was really spectacular. So you mentioned the Channel Islands earlier, and I really encourage you to get out there during the springtime.
How do you get out there? Do you have to rent a boat, or there regular?
No, there's regular charters or boats that go out there through the Ventura Harbor. It's called
Okay.
Island Packers.
Island Packers. Thank you very much.
Island Packers. Okay.
Yeah.
What's
And
the best
we
time to
actually
go?
went out camping, so we were out there for 2 nights, and
Nice.
it was really great. Thank you again, Andrea, for organizing that trip. It was just fabulous.
What was a good time of year? When did you go?
The last weekend in April.
April.
Oh, really? That late? Oh, okay.
It was a late year for us this year, I think, and not just late, but extended.
Yeah.
So, we had spring wildflowers well into May.
Yeah, you had the earlier ones at the same time as the later ones. And we found that the tidy tips were really late up here. They normally bloom at the same time as the gold fields, and all these other flowers were blooming, but the tidy tips were late.
We found that the milkmaids, these pretty little white flowers, maybe you have them down there, which are some of the first flowers to bloom, were still blooming in May, which was really unusual. So they were blooming from February all the way into May. It was just kind of crazy year.
Yeah.
Do you guys go to, it just went out of my mind.
The answer is yes.
The creek that's on, I think, 58 going towards the Carrizo Plain.
Oh, Snell Creek
Shell.
Road.
Shell Creek.
Shell
Yeah,
Creek.
Yeah.
We heard it was really good from some of
It
the
was
botanists
spectacular
down
this
there.
year. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, we've been there once, and there's just amazing diversity of flowers, and I guess it's still ranchland.
It's private property, but they allow you to go there during flower time.
Any other questions? Let's see.
Question. I was wondering if you had ever been to Garrapatta.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
That's pretty amazing.
We didn't get to the fire area, which
Yeah, we've been to
What year?
Garrapatta.
Sobrantes.
Yeah.
It was a Sobrantes fire, but it was
Right.
in Garrapatta. And I went there right after it for the next spring, and it was fabulous.
yeah, we heard it was really good after fires, it can, if you get enough rain, you can just be amazing what'll happen in that area, in a burn area, as long as it hasn't burned too hot.
Correct.
Yeah, plus you have the beautiful views from up there in Garrapatta.
Oh, I know. You feel like you're in an airplane.
Could you say more about, I was surprised. I think you were saying like super blooms are unusual to California. I mean, I've been in California for so long. I don't know what's happening elsewhere, like in terms of good rain and, years where there's lots of flowers, but it seemed like we have a unique thing in
Well, you
California?
get, you
Well, the
get
deserts, yeah,
you get super blooms in Arizona,
right.
in other areas as well. I think what I was referring to, may have been referring to, is that they used to call them 100-year blooms because you'd only get the conditions every 100 years.
Mhm.
But because of climate change, we would have these droughts that would stress everything, but then we would have this deluge. And so they ended up having quote unquote 100-year blooms every 5 to 7 years. So they don't call them 100-year blooms anymore. They call them super blooms.
Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess I was just wondering about how is California, is there anything unique about our super blooms compared to other super blooms?
Well, there's a lot of different types of deserts. So even if you're getting a desert super bloom, Joshua Tree will be completely different from Death Valley, which could be completely different from Anza Borrego. So I don't know if other states have as much of a variety as we do here. We have been in Arizona during a super bloom down at the Mexican border in Oregon Pipe, and that was pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
And California is, what do they call it with the UN?
Oh, it has its own, you probably all know it has its own floristic province. I think California has something like 7,000 native species, which is greater than any other state. And you would expect that because of the diversity of habitats, from redwood forests
Yeah.
on the coast all the way down to Anza Borrego. So
And up to the mountains,
Yeah.
and
I think we have 6,500.
6,500.
oh, thank you.
Yeah, and about 1,500 of those are endemic to California only.
Yeah. Peter Raven, you may know who he is, did a wonderful first essay in the book called The Evolution of California's Beautiful Plants. And I think he goes into a little bit about what makes it different here, what makes it so different here, but you already probably know that anyway.
He also wrote the foreword for the book as well.
Well, you did oh, wow, those pictures are amazing. So where do you get the book? Is it on Amazon too, or no?
No,
No,
they
we don't do Amazon.
They don't give you enough money at the end.
I know, I have a book on there, but anyway, so you go to
Wildflower.
Wildflower.
Yeah, Wildflower Books or Wildflower Book. It's on here as Wildflower Book on the website.
Put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then winterbadger.com if you want to see some of our other work, the Rob's environmental work or My People photography. You can, and also the birds. You can explore it on winterbadger.com. And then there's a link for the book as well.
I'm not going to sell them at botanical gardens or anything like that.
They are at some of them.
We're trying.
Okay.
Which is the closest one?
Well, Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens, I'm a volunteer there. I'll talk to them about getting it.
Yeah, they may have it or find out if it's in stock, and if not, they should order some more.
Yeah. Okay.
We try to remind people to restock, but they don't always do it. But yeah, well, the book came out 2 months before the pandemic, which completely changed our plans. One of the advantages is Zoom calls became possible, Zoom presentations, and we didn't have to travel around the state to just give a talk to a particular area. But it was also more difficult to sell books when you're not doing it in person. It definitely made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And also all the botanical gardens and museums, they all closed up. And by the time they opened again, they said, well, we have too much inventory, so we're not buying anything new. And the San Diego Natural History Museum, they didn't have their store open for the first probably 8 months our exhibit was up. And they eventually started carrying it, but we would have thought that would have been a great place to have the book, especially when you have 12-foot images in their gallery.
There's a distributor, I forget the name, you must know them, that they distribute to all the museums all over the country. So you just go with them and they'll handle it all.
Yeah, I talked to them early on in the pandemic, and they just said they weren't doing much, and I haven't been able to get a response from them since. But I'm trying to think of their name, something with event in the name. But I'll thank you for the reminder. I'll try again and see if we can get them.
I have one more question.
Oh,
Sure.
you can have two more.
About how many days a week are you out shooting, would you say?
Nowadays,
Well, like in a good, like a spring, like almost every day, or?
well, when no, we aren't, because we're trying to sell the book and we're
Yeah.
working on hospital projects and that type of thing.
Mhm.
But when there were really good blooms, we could go out for 3 or 4 weeks at a time.
Mhm.
And that was really, really fun. I mean, we would go to Arizona or New Mexico or even Southern California,
Colorado.
Colorado, up in Yankee Boy Basin,
But
different areas.
locally, when we were doing it, maybe once a week, because
Okay.
well, we have photo businesses to run, and
Right.
it's like 10% photography and 90% business.
Yeah.
Right.
We're members of the West Point Inn, which is a historic inn on Mount Tamalpais.
Oh, yeah.
And so we would hike up there on a regular basis, and we always had our cameras. So we generally didn't take pictures on the way in, but on our way back, Mount Tam was a great place for photographs.
You may recall the image of people hiking on a fire road in the
Mhm.
fog with the azalea plant.
Yeah.
Well, that's public land on Mount
Right.
Tam. There are, I don't know, like 3 different government organizations that are associated with public land, and there's a lot of diversity. So going someplace, I'm always carrying camera gear. So
Yeah, it took us 3 years to put the book together.
Mm.
Working with a group of authors is like herding cats. And so not only were we dealing with designing it and raising funds and trying to get some pre-sales, but we also we worked with over 20 authors and ended up keeping the work from 16 of them.
and I was the editor for the first 2 drafts, because someone had to look at every essay to make sure that there wasn't repeated information. And so after going through the first 2 drafts, we, that assured me that there was no repetition, then we handed it over to a real professional editor. But it was fun because I got to read a lot of the essays over and over and over.
So when you go to different states, you drive because you have a lot of equipment. So you're not.
Yeah, we
flying.
always
Yeah.
drove, and we always camped.
Yeah.
As we got older, camping wasn't as much fun, but and we got a van that helped. But we never cooked. We didn't have stoves because we almost always came back in the dark. There was always another flower to photograph. And so it was canned food and salami and cheese and crackers.
And we didn't like tents unless there were bugs. So it's always, as it's always nice waking up in the morning with a sky overhead. And yeah, we haven't done that for a while.
And now I want to put together some children's books about flowers. And possibly Rob has a buddy named Zorro. He's a Beanie Baby monkey, and he's Rob's spiritual advisor and art critic. He was in one of the photographs, the one with the desert lilies. And he's going to tell the stories about us as 2 people who love flowers so much. We dedicated our lives to photographing them and protecting them. And then also a few other, maybe a couple other books which help kids identify flowers, such as bear grass and monkey flower, and names that'll be really common.
Pussy ears, tiger lily.
So somebody asked about particular camera type.
Well, it depends on what you're going to use with the, you know, what your end use for the images is. I can only recommend what it is I need for what we do. We use a Sony mirrorless camera. We've been using Canon lenses and Canon cameras for years, so I bought an adapter. Metabones adapter lets me adapt my Canon lenses, but I'm using the Sony A7R3. It's a full frame sensor, like a 35 millimeter size sensor, and it's a 42 megapixel camera that gives me enough resolution that we can make these big, huge files that go into healthcare, things like that.
So
So
most people don't need one that
no,
big, but
so
it's,
I'm not a good person to advise you. I'm sorry.
yeah, it depends
I
on-
only know what I need.
Well, thank you both so much. That was lovely. Thanks for your time and thanks for sharing your journey and your art with us.
Oh, our pleasure, our pleasure. And again, we apologize that you had to call us to get us.
That's so embarrassing. Sorry.
Not to worry. You
We've
made
never
it.
done this before.
Really?
We're really responsible.
I forgot to set
people.
my alarm to remind me that, oh, we have a program.
We both did great. Thanks for coming.
You're
Sure.
welcome. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for all the
Thank
questions.
you.
This is always the fun part.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.